down the street from UConn. I also went to school here. I went to school at the Hart School, where I did my undergrad in piano performance and music theory. And now I am a TA at UConn, and I'm doing my master's there in piano performance. For whatever reason, I mean, we had a piano at home, and I was just drawn to the instrument. And my parents even have a picture of me when I was scarcely 1 year old. I actually don't have any pants on in the picture, and I'm reaching up, you know, I was maybe yay tall, and I'm actually reaching up to the keys like this. And so, I mean, I started playing with the instrument when I was very, very, very little. I taught myself to read music when I was 4 or so, and I would kind of play things on my own. And I begged my parents for lessons for a very long time, and at first, they didn't want to give me lessons ahead of my going to school, but they eventually gave in. So by the time I was 7, I actually started taking formal lessons, and then really there was no doubt that this was what I was going to do with my life from pretty early on.
So the guy from Connecticut wants to play piano.
The guy from Connecticut wants to play piano.
What's the future? How do you see your future? In other words, what are your dreams and what do you think is possible?
Well, well, anything's possible, I guess. But really my dream is just to be able to share music with as many people as I possibly can. I don't have any great ambitions about, you know, being the next piano superstar or anything like that. I mean, I never really have been ambitious in that way.
And yet when we played a concert together, that was, what, about 7 years ago by now, maybe more. I remember you coming on stage, and after a very good performance of Liszt Concerto, with the Youth Symphony, which by default wasn't necessarily the greatest orchestra on the planet, you enticed the audience to stand up for you. I remember that.
Well, I mean, I was, what, 16?
What changed since you were 16?
The main thing I would say that's changed about me since then is that I've become a lot more contemplative about things. And so I'm now more of a person who tends to reflect. You know? I mean, we all have our moments, but I tend, you know, to be one, I think, who, yeah, I react to things, but I spend a lot more time, you know, kind of considering what I'm going to do, how I'm going to go about this. I mean, it kind of happens to all of us.
In your biographical information that I happened to dig out, there is not the one that you sent me, the official one, but the one I published, in fact, is the one that speaks about your passion for poetry. Now, if you be so kind to indulge us with a little bit of depth on that issue.
Ezra Pound once said that music begins to atrophy if it gets too far from the dance. But I think also, I mean, if we could make a kind of continuum here, and I think that there's another side to that, which is, you know, because when we think of dance, we think of something that's much more kind of dynamic and, you know, it's about the flow of movement and everything like that. But I think music also can't exactly live without sort of a poetic element. And I think that, I mean, there's definitely always been a profound connection between particularly the arts of poetry and of music. And so I became very drawn to poetry, you know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. It's been an ambition of mine to, I memorize I memorize large swaths of poetry, and so like I know pretty much all the major poems of T.S. Eliot. By memory, I know 100 or so sonnets of Shakespeare. And that's something that really began only for my own edification, and it's something that I kind of, you know, it's a little world that I enjoyed moving in for a while at a time in my life when I wasn't really doing that much else.
Now, music also lives, in my opinion, lives in real life, in other words, particularly from the standpoint of live music, the one that we perform for others. It has to be relevant for them. And it's very interesting that you would mention the poetry as something that connects with music, and perhaps on the other side with the human emotion in general. I see it as a kind of a bridge, although, of course, if you're the poet, you might consider music to be the bridge, because you need the bridge as an alternative kind of thing. But my question, where I'm going with this question, is that reality check. In other words, what inspires you to play for people, if anything? How do you see yourself as a performer? And of course, the fact that you are drawn to poetry, that's very inspiring. I share that in some sense. But my question is basically about the reality check and all of this.
Yeah.
How do you see the audience?
There's a transmission of energy which occurs between any performing artist who really does their job and an audience that is there for good reasons and listens attentively. An audience that listens in good faith. And most immediately, it's about that transmission of energy. I mean, as far as the content of the transmission goes, I would like to believe that what's really being put across there is that which is most essential about our life experience. In other words, I've done a whole number of things in the course of today. Got up, took a shower, did my laundry. There's a whole series of mundane tasks. But then if we sift and sift and sift, and we sift not only on the level of what did I do today that really mattered, but in the course of a lifetime, in the course of a whole number of lifetimes, you get these essential moments that are somehow more real than other ones. And I think that art in general, and this includes music, is a kind of attempt to capture those moments, or at least to capture their image, so that it can be, then that can be transmitted from one person to another. And there is a certain, obviously, we were talking about the Tchaikovsky concerto, and I don't know what inspired him to write it or anything like that, and we come from two radically different periods, radically different social setups and all of that. But nonetheless, when you hear some of the melodies that are in there, there's a certain kind of a content there that somehow manages to bridge all of that. And that's what I really think it's all about. You almost the performer and the audience almost come to a certain kind of understanding. An understanding which transcends all of their many, many differences. It's, Rubinstein said that the performance was the moment of truth. And I think that's true not only in terms of, the quality of the performance, but I think it's true of the content. It's a moment of reality, which in a way kind of turns, I think, conventional perceptions on their head, because, you know, we tend to think of going to a concert as a kind of a diversion, you know, a way of getting away from the real world and everything. But look, you can pursue all kinds of, you know, different worldly ambitions, you know, get this job, you know, drive that car, marry this woman, all of that stuff. But you're always, you know, no matter how practically on top of things you are, and no matter how much you think you have it together, there are always going to be certain kinds of preoccupations, you know. What does a person really think about at the moment of death?
Now, how old are you now?
You know, I'm 27.
Do you think about those
Yes.
preoccupations?
I have been thinking about those things for quite some time. I mean,
Why?
I don't even know if I could answer that question. Why?
Now, you shaped your philosophy, if you use this term in the universal sense, as a sort of key to understanding a person, over, let's just say, 20-something years now. Who was or who were the greatest inspiration or inspirations? Both in terms of your teachers and perhaps in terms of people that inspired you because they have written something. I mentioned Shakespeare or Rubinstein. Would you like to elaborate on others if you wish?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, practically every major poet has addressed these questions, and so I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about is derived from that. If one reads, you know, he did write poems, but I mean, he wasn't strictly speaking a poet. Marcel Proust, Remembrance of Things Past, was, you know, is a great reflection on a number of these things. Personally, I consider myself very lucky to come from a family where these kinds of things are talked about. You know, that includes my parents, my sadly now deceased grandparents. Many of my friends and I spend our time talking about these things, so I guess I'm surrounded by a whole bunch of crazy people. And you know, obviously, everyone who's taught me music. I mean, all of my musical colleagues. These are, and you know, that includes
the guy behind the camera.
The guy behind the camera deserves some credit here.
Thank you very much.
As he no doubt knows. And yeah, I feel lucky to be surrounded by the people I'm surrounded by. And you know, also to have had the good fortune to have been born into, you know, a place where I can have access, you know, to the kind of cultural influences that I've had access to.
This particular piano concerto, number 1, is famous, among other things, for the fact that in Moscow at the Tchaikovsky competition there was a great American pianist whose name just right now escapes me. But
Van Cliburn, of course.
thank you very much. Yes, of course.
I actually listened to his recording of the concerto on my way over here.
Yeah. Who bridged in some magical way both traditions, because I think that when one listens to that performance, one can see how Russian music is American and vice versa. And we did talk about music, for example, from Dr. Zhivago, which has not much to do with Tchaikovsky's piano concerto in its core, but nevertheless one can sort of find certain inspirations, if not particular, then certainly in general sense, being there. Would you elaborate on the inspiration, or what do you think? Maybe that's not inspiration, but what do you think about von Cliburn and sort of that magical moment in history in which behind the curtain of communism, the cultural miracles can happen, such as that one that I mentioned.
I think that the phenomenon of Van Cliburn's remarkable performance in that competition. Well, it was seized on at the time, for certain political purposes. I mean, I think if anything, it flew in the face of those, in the sense that it shows the way that I think art is able to reach beyond. It's able, in a certain sense, to transcend, oftentimes arbitrary and irrational, the irrational barriers that exist between people in the world, and there are many of those today. But that's not really the subject of this discussion. And so, I mean, if anything, I think it's an example. I mean, it's one that I would refer to with some caution, but it's an example of this kind of universal connection that I was trying to get at earlier in this conversation. And I think that's that was one of the remarkable things about him as a performer. Was, I mean, he had a certain kind of spontaneous imagination that allowed him to captivate. I mean, despite the fact that he never, I don't know that he ever really finished his artistic development, in the sense that someone like Richter, or Rubinstein, or Horowitz did. I don't think he ever reached that kind of a level, and then he became a great pianist, and that creates all kinds of difficulties. But nonetheless, he did have that ability to, kind of to sort of bridge the gap from one consciousness to another.
This summer you studied, among other people, I'm sure, with Jolanta Raszelska, who happened to be here for a few weeks. A very prominent Polish teacher, and perhaps for those of our viewers who are, as we know in New Britain, from the Polish community, I think it will be very curious to know what do you think about her approach, and sort of give us a fresh view at that experience of yours, if you don't mind.
Well, it was first of all, it was a very rewarding experience to have some lessons with Jolanta and to get to know her in as much as I could, since I don't speak any Polish or Russian or German or any of the languages that she speaks, and she speaks a few words of English. I think she speaks a little more English than she'll take credit for. Nonetheless, all of our lessons had to be done through an interpreter and all of that, and a lot of it was just very kind of hands-on, like no, this, and a lot of demonstration too. I know she studied with a student of, pardon my pronunciation, Ralph Kozlowski.
Mm-hmm.
How would you?
Kozlowski.
Kozlowski,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. You know, whose playing of Chopin is just unbelievable. He was one of the great pianists of the 20th century, and you know he he had quite quite a number of proteges who in turn taught people like Yolanta. And so I mean that in and of itself, I mean, that's a very, very rich kind of a pianistic heritage right there. That I mean, ultimately stretches back to Chopin. Mm-hmm. And that carries with it certain kind of physical approach to piano playing that she did her best to instill in me, in the short time that we had. But it was a lot of things about legato and about wrist technique and things like that I wasn't I didn't have a systematic knowledge of. I had been exposed to that sort of thing before, but she was very insistent on it, and I think for the best. And I certainly benefited from the whole experience. And another level on which I really enjoyed it was the fact that she brought in a lot of a certain knowledge of what Russianness is, which I mean I'm very far from being nationalistic in any sense. However, you do need to have some kind of a consciousness of that when you're dealing with something like as national as Tchaikovsky. I mean, I'm aware of that. I'm in another area of my playing because I like to play a lot of Villa-Lobos, and I have many Brazilian friends. My wife is from Brazil and all of that. And so I feel that I have a certain knowledge of the kind of cultural spirit that animates that music, and that's very beneficial. There's at the very opening, the orchestra has this, is the piano kind of just has these broad chords behind it, and then there's this intervening material, but then it comes back and just this soaring with the melody again with the violins, and just it's like an entire panorama opening up before you with that's the background. That's the background. And then the melody is just this, I mean, again, the only thing I can think of is just this vast, vast landscape, and then the piano. Russian dance thing. Actually, when Yolanta coached me on it, she made me get up and dance. I won't recreate that experience, but this kind of
Daniel, it was a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah.
And I hope that people come and hear you perform this concerto in its entirety.
I think it's clear that I have a lot of impressions and a lot of feelings which are bound up with this piece, and that I would be delighted to share. Hope to see you there.
I'd like to thank you for your wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.